one small point I want to make is when you mentioned kind of here human psychology. That's interesting as well in that it maybe relates to one of the very first things you talked about in that interview here, which is like what would like space colonization actually look like? And it probably actually looks a lot more compact and a lot kind of smaller spacecrafts than what seems to be observed as well, right? Which are these kind of bigger, or I guess sometimes as well, just what we imagine UFOs or something to look like from media.
And indeed, people's imaginations people's reports about the UFOs seem to follow quite a lot of our cultural ideas. Yeah. There was much more diversity in UFOs in the past. Now people are much more into the standard flying saucer and everything. A lot of alien contact stories were all over the place. And of course, you still find it if you read the right conspiracy or New Age website, where you have not just the little greys, which are kind of the most popular ones, but also, of course, the very Aryan blonde Venusians or the reptilians and so on. Very whole genres here. And that is, of course, much that people retelling the same stories. Mm-hmm. But you don't get quite as many cigar-shaped things. We standardized it. Yet they never show up where you can get a good shot with a webcam or a cell phone camera. They're always kind of weird, out of focus. And part of that is, of course, when they're in focus, there is quite often an easy explanation for what it is. Mm. Now, the interesting thing is, of course, why are people so interested in UFOs? I think that is also an important part. Mm. And this is part of our modern mythology. To some extent, we have replaced the kind of Greek gods and the heroes with the cartoon characters. Batman is our new form of Hercules. Mm. And indeed, many people are using them to reason about the world and mirror virtues and sins in various ways. People are using Star Wars as a mythology, and it makes sense to kind of teach kids about how to behave. When you grow up, you should follow the light side of the Force, and they kind of understand what you mean by that.
Yeah.
Now, the interesting thing is also that you want to maybe say this is real, not just nice comics, because it's kind of hard to avoid knowing that Batman isn't real. Gotham doesn't quite exist, and the galaxy far, far away is actually thanks to George Lucas. So many people would want, of course, to say, no, the angels and gods are real, or the next best thing, well, there are aliens around. And indeed, some people have been arguing very seriously that, well, if there is an old advanced civilization, we should totally ask it for advice. It makes a lot of sense, which of course leads to some of the interesting controversies in the community thinking about extraterrestrial intent. Mm-hmm. Should we try to send messages to them? And we had a vote in the UK SETI Research Network raising hands, kind of, should we? And half of the room were dead set against it, and half of the room were in favor of it. And then we're just looking at each other.
Yeah, I'm aware this is just going like deeply down a tangent, but one like video essay I absolutely loved, I think it's like called After Hours. It's a YouTube series by Cracked, I think, but was about exactly like, what like role do like UFOs or like aliens play in like pop culture? And one interesting point there was that we are like really aware, like I guess in the West and especially in America and Europe, of just like how colonization happened and how like sometimes somebody can just appear with like tremendous amounts of like technology and can just lead to like a destruction of like whatever civilization or tribes were before there. And that fear is like deeply ingrained as well with our obsession with UFOs, that there's just like some kind of underlying fear of just a species coming along with just much better technology and then being able to wipe us out in a similar way that we'd had like done so in the past and stuff. I think that's interesting as well.
Yeah, and it actually links up to something interesting about Western civilization itself. David Brin pointed out that Western civilization has this relatively unique property as a civilization, being slightly obsessed with being wrong. Mm. Most civilizations have been very, very firmly confident that we are the center of the world, what we know is morally and factually right, and that's it. Mm. What has happened in Western civilization since the Enlightenment is that we have made doubt something very valuable. Actually asking, are we a good civilization? And seriously trying to find the answer to that, and quite often coming up with, no, we're not good enough, or we might actually be quite awful. We should replace ourselves with something better. That has been a winning trick. Because we have been inventing new institutions. We have been questioning old things. I think actually this is a very important trait. And then, of course, the UFO concern that maybe there is a civilization out there that could do unto us as we have done to others. It both fits in with a kind of guilty conscience, but also this realization that we are kind of fragile. It's very interesting to note that, for example, China doesn't like disasters that wipe out the Chinese nation. Existential threats to all of humanity is good as long as you don't show China disappearing. There is something in Chinese culture that seems to be against this idea that, Chinese culture could be totally wrong. While in Western culture, that's kind of the starting point, and then we want to prove that we're right about this thing at least, temporarily. Now, David Brin talks about the meme of otherness. We have this idea that there could be other good ideas out there that we could borrow from other civilizations, whether they are human civilizations or ancient civilizations or even alien civilizations. And I think that's actually quite valuable. There is a degree of epistemic humility. Now, of course, most people, most of the time, don't go around doubting their civilization. Quite a lot of people are totally rah nationalists and my country right or wrong, and totally don't disbelieve the science. Even though science is, of course, organized doubt and searching for what's actually true, rather than just believing whoever is waving the science flag. But I think it's an important thing to recognize that the thinking about alien intelligence and alien civilizations are an important way of thinking about our own position, both kind of as a civilization on Earth among other cultures, but also, what are humans? What kind of thing in the universe are we?
Yeah, I love this point that one of the best predictors of whether your society is going to survive much longer is whether everyone believes that we've got things figured out already. And really the best way to, first of all, survive and also make progress, given that you've survived, is just this kind of constant doubt, like Popper style. We've probably got most things wrong. Let's keep kind of figuring out our errors and then correcting them. And then there's this point about, part and parcel of this organized doubt is looking to some other as like a source of inspiration or something. And it's making me think, right? So you're talking about, we could imagine alien visiting. We can make films about aliens and about superheroes. We can look to other cultures that aren't our own. We can also kind of just deliberately imagine cultures and kind of ways of structuring society for the express purpose of learning from, right? You're talking about exploratory engineering at the start of this conversation. You could do something like exploratory engineering, but for kind of culture or something, or sets of values.
It's like utopian thinking, right?
Yeah. And indeed, one of the most valuable things is people setting up utopian communes. We actually know a fair bit about how they work by now. Usually they don't work. It's actually a really valuable thing to know some of the failure modes of that kind of small societies and which of them that actually survive. So there are ways of thinking ahead on this, and this is of course like evolution. Indeed, this is a continuation, I think, of that evolutionary approach. Evolution doesn't work if you don't have variation and mutation, but then you need selection. You need to check what actually fits in reality. And of course, evolution is really myopic. It doesn't only care about the current generation. It doesn't notice that it might be sliding in a direction that is eventually not going to work for this species. And we are a little bit better at thinking ahead and notice, wait a minute, if we start this utopian commune, given past evidence, they tend to crash. Maybe we can do something to fix that. The Amish people, for example, in the United States, they have been thinking very careful about how to maintain themselves as a culture inside a bigger culture that works very differently, including not losing too many members that just leave. Because there are many other religious groups that have found that, they lost all their members, or at least their kids all joined the minority culture. Now, the Amish have found some institutional solutions that make them much more stable. And that forethought applies, of course, in a lot of domains, and that's a sign of intelligence. Then the question is intelligence enough? Which I think is the big Fermi question. I do think that intelligence can potentially remake a large chunk of the universe. In my current work on the book Grand Futures, where I'm trying to summarize what I know about stuff, I have a chapter about how to literally move stars and galaxies. And it looks like you can reorganize matter up to about 20 megaparsec scale or more with tinfoil, or aluminium foil actually, because that's easier to get. So basically you do, and this is a good example of exploratory engineering. How do you move a star? Well, first you place a lot of aluminium foil in orbit around it. So you basically make a hemisphere to reflect sunlight in one direction. So this produces a very, very tiny thrust. You can maintain this hemisphere in position by having little flaps and so we can little fins to change the reflection, so the pieces stay together. You need a bit of electronics on it, but it's very, very light. Now, after about 1 million years or 4, you're going to have a random encounter with another star, except that it's not going to be a random one, because you put, of course, aluminium foil about both stars and are adjusting how they approach each other, so they do a gravity assist. And suddenly, your star is now moving tens of kilometers in a different direction. That tiny thrust from the aluminium foil is just for very mild steering. You use these rapid encounters to really, really direct and speed around stars. So at this point you can arrange them, make them join up in binaries. You can eject them from the galaxy by flinging them past a central black hole. And this way you can actually move galaxies. Now, why would you want to do that? Well, that depends. You might want to dodge the Andromeda galaxy because it's coming right at us, but a more likely thing might be we want to arrange Andromeda and Milky Way so they merge in a perfect way without any waste. And you might want to send a lot of stars together to form a kind of artificial hypercluster that can resist the expansion of the universe. So in a few 100 billion years, when all the galaxy clusters just disappear over the horizon, you're still sitting in this gigantic cluster and that has a lot of resources. Now the point is, if this happens or not depends on whether intelligent life decides this is a good idea. Maybe it's actually a really stupid idea and nobody should do it. Maybe some future post-human Elon Musk decides to do it because of big ego or some particular ethical theory. But basically, the structure of matter on this vast scale would be determined by intelligence. And the cool thing is, of course, that the overall structure of the universe right now, up until this point, has been set mostly by the standard physics. You basically get an overall structure set by the oscillations and the baryonic sound modes in the early universe, which create something called the end of greatness scale at about 200 megaparsec. Beyond that, it looks fairly homogeneous. Below that scale, you get these gigantic voids and filaments of galaxies. And the galaxies have a shape that is determined by how we cohere because of stars and dark matter. Intelligent life is a bit like Maxwell's demon in that thought experiment. By nudging things at the right moment, it can make things move into a very unlikely state. This is what we're doing all the time on Earth's surface. We're arranging various materials in very unlikely states. And some of these states are like magnifying glasses that, because of their peculiar shape, suddenly have a property that's rarely seen in nature. Others are like aggregating a lot of plutonium in a spherical shell. Suddenly you get a very rare thing that can explode. That doesn't normally happen. In laboratories, you get temperatures that are lower than the rest of the universe. Indeed, in every home, we have this device that seems to seemingly break thermodynamics, the refrigerator. We have carefully set up various liquids and gases in such a way that we actually cool things down. And this is, I think, typical for intelligence. So when you try to search for intelligence in the universe, you want to look for really unlikely states. And an advanced civilization might do this on a vast scale and turn the universe ever into more unlikely things. And I think this is good because the entropy is fairly boring. But life and the intelligence can create these low entropy states that are full of meaning and might be doing really surprising things.
Yeah. And I agree that fridges are underrated. That's my takeaway.
One could probably do an entire podcast just about fridges and how they link up to everything, both thermodynamics and human flourishing.
Yeah. If you want to come on again, you're more than welcome to talk about
fridges. On fridges.
Totally. Yeah, and there are so many interesting questions about where are the ultimate limit of fridges? How close can you get to absolute zero? Why would you want to? What about if you wanted to cool down an entire planet? How do you make a fridge for a planet?
Okay, let's talk a bit about transhumanism. Natural place to start is defining this thing. Lots of ways of doing it, of course. But is there some way to kind of briefly summarize the transhumanist worldview? What's the core idea?
So the core idea, I think, is questioning the human condition and saying, these parts are bad, we should fix them using technological means. So you can look at it from a history of ideas perspective and say, well, this is an outgrowth of Renaissance and Enlightenment ideas that we can make humanism. We can make the world better for people, and people matter. But traditional humanism was about education, maybe setting up the right institutions so people could grow and thrive. And transhumanism continues that by saying, yep, that's great, but also we should fix aging and make ourselves less stupid. And why should we have just these senses? Now, you can do all sorts of versions of this. So some people say, well, what about humanity transforming itself? It's no longer evolution that is changing us, but we're doing auto-evolution. We're modifying ourselves. And you can say, well, maybe this is about kind of reaching some kind of next stage. You can say maybe a transhuman stage, but then eventually become post-human because we have enhanced and improved on ourselves so much that we're no longer like the previous species. We might actually recognize that there is a fundamental difference. Now, there is a lot, as you say, there is a lot of different takes on this. Transhumanists generally don't agree on all the takes, which is kind of fun. It's also very annoying because when people criticize transhumanists, they're usually criticizing one group. And then I can always say, yeah, but I'm not in that group. I totally disagree with them just as much as you do. Indeed, I found an interesting paper online where a Jesuit was arguing that transhumanists and Catholics should make a common cause against their joint enemy, the postmodernists. And it makes sense. Yeah, the many transhumanists are quite staunch Enlightenment defenders and don't agree with many of the postmodernists. Except, of course, that you also get postmodernist transhumanists. There are the critical posthumanists, which are a completely separate group of academics questioning the Enlightenment anthropocentrism. But I think that if you are serious about becoming post-human in a transhumanist sense, you might still want to think a bit about that, because when you decenter from humanity, you need to think about, well, where do I get my values from? What kind of being do I want to be? Does even me and want make any sense here? And suddenly you get into rather deep philosophical waters.
So you mentioned that there are like lots of different takes on transhumanism. I'm really curious about what your own take is, or what you see as kind of the core ideas that you would like to see happen, and what you would kind of want transhumanism to be.
So generally, I think there is a lot of human limitations that are really bringing us down. So an obvious one is aging. There is not that much time for any human to actually learn how to be a good human, to actually acquire skills and knowledge and wisdom to actually do something good. And then our bodies start breaking down and we lose the energy that we might have needed to use that wisdom to use in a good way. And our life projects are necessarily cut short. I think we should make aging and death optional. That's one pretty obvious thing. Another thing is our brains. They're probably about the dumbest brains that could produce a global technological civilization. I think we're normally trying to solve this by leaning on each other. We're doing a lot of very clever group cognition. But we have demonstrated that we can make things better, both in the sense of improving coordination by using information networks and outsourcing to machines, but also sometimes improving the brains themselves. Similarly, there are many aspects of human existence that we might want better control over, like our emotions. Can we refine them? Can we make them better? And of course, traditionally, the answer has been, well, meditate on it, or read these very good books for you. But obviously, we can modify our emotions biochemically too. We might want to look into what can be used here in a useful way. This is, of course, also dangerous and tricky because, for example, controlling our motivation might be a great way for focusing on finishing up that paper, but it might also turn us into workaholics that lose out on value. There is a very important question about how do you enhance yourself in a direction of higher value. And of course, like the philosopher John Harris, you can say, actually, enhancement is by definition going towards higher value. So enhancement is always good. It's just that it's not always clear that something is an enhancement. Nicotine is an attention sharpener, but smoking is, of course, rather bad for you and you get addicted. Is that a net improvement or not? It might very well depend on your situation.
Yeah, on the aging thing, we were chatting about this recently, right? So if you're imagining comparing the kind of value of two good lives, both lived to about 80 years, or one good life lived to 160 years, when we're thinking about the value of living much longer than a natural human lifespan. What's the case for extending?
Well, if one regards lives as interchangeable, then of course we might say maybe we should just aim at much shorter lives but replace people at a higher rate. Many people would say, wait a minute, that doesn't sound good. So we have actually an interesting situation where we might have a status quo bias, thinking that this is the ideal length of life. But historically, it's been changing. It kind of doubled over the 20th century in many parts of the world, and yet people always felt that this is the right length of life. Mm-hmm. But more seriously, I think the reason you don't want to have two short lives in favor of one long is that you lose something when people die. We're very contingent beings. Our personality, our way of thinking and looking at the world is something that we will never repeat. We have so many internal degrees of freedom that get organized by genes, environment, and our own actions that you can't recreate a human. And it's fairly easy to recreate a cell with the same genome and it behaves roughly in the same way. If you plant a tree, it's going to roughly grow up in the same way. But when you get to more complicated organisms like humans, you don't get the same thing. Something that can never be repeated have been lost. Of course, some people maybe are nasty and have horrible lives, so maybe there is a good thing that it's not going to get repeated. But in most cases, I think there are at least some unique, very valuable things in a life that are irretrievably lost when that life ends. So in that case, that 160-year life avoids at least one such loss.
Yeah, and one interesting thing I want to pick up on there that you mentioned at the start is really, I guess, the anchoring effect that just like nature seems to have and like setting our expectations. That when we gave the example here, we focus on 80 years because that seems to be natural at the moment. But as you rightfully said, at many points in history in the past, that very much like wasn't natural. And you could imagine that people would have said 40 or 60 years or something instead. And likewise, there's nothing inherent about those numbers being what it means to live a good life or what it means to be wise or to just assume that evolution is optimizing for these things.
Yeah, we're living in a society where practically everybody is literate and have an enormous amount of education. By historical standards, this is an extremely unnatural state. It's very unusual. Yet we think that having people read and write, that's normal. We don't recognize that even the couch potato who just want to watch Games of Thrones actually is a highly literate person. By medieval standards, they are a real scholar. They actually know an enormous amount of non-trivial historical information, not just about the fictional world, but even things going into it if we're somewhat of a fan. Mm. And this anchoring is, of course, one of the big battles about transhumanism. I mean, transhumanism is very good at being controversial. Questioning the human condition is bound to get people to say, wait a minute, I want to defend how it is. And one reason is, of course, that we get very uneasy if somebody questions the way we are. In particular, at some point in life, we have to confront our own mortality. And people typically construct some way of handling that with some equanimity. And it might be that you become religious or existentialist or just choose not to think about it. And then these guys show up and say, actually, in the lab, we're kind of slowing down aging and fixing mortality. You might not have to die, or maybe your grandchildren might not have to die. At that point, that person is kicking a bit at your existential foundations. And I get quite a lot of pushback from people who get very upset and start defending stuff that would normally be undefendable. Like many of the bad sides of aging, because we just think that the alternative makes them way more uneasy. Mm. But it's kind of weird because aging kills about 100,000 people per day. Mm. If there was a disease doing that, we would say, okay, COVID was nothing. We need to fight this with everything we got. Yeah. But now people are kind of taking it for granted and instead saying, why should we give any funding to those weirdos trying to slow down this? Yeah. Meanwhile, the bodies pile up.
Yeah, no, absolutely. And it makes me think of the Nick Bostrom essay, right? The Fable of the Dragon Tyrant as well, which we'll add to the show notes, but it's very good.
Yeah, and it's interesting because this status quo bias, we might, of course, joke at it in some respect, but there is this disquieting thing that we might be accepting things that are really unacceptable. Mm. One of the beauties of the human condition is that we can adapt to almost anything. That's also one of the great tragedies, because we can adapt to and get used to absolutely horrible things and say, this is normal, this is fine. Mm. So there could be these moral disasters unfolding around us that we're not even noticing. Historically, we have been accepting sexism and racism and homophobia, it might be that now we're starting to realize that, factory farming is causing enormous amount of suffering. But it's still kind of a relatively small concern. But in 100 years, it might be that people are looking back, why didn't most people rise up against the chicken farms?
Is the reversal test relevant here? Do you want to say something about it?
So the reversal test is a paper by Nick Bostrom and Toby Ord, which is one way of dealing with this kind of status quo bias. So when you propose some enhancement, quite often people say, no, that's going to make things worse. In that case, if going in that direction makes things worse, shouldn't we expect things to be better in the opposite direction? If giving people intelligence-enhancing drugs is bad for some reason, shouldn't lowering intelligence be a good thing? And if you have just status quo bias, then you're of course going to be opposed to that one too. In some rare cases, people might actually think that, actually ignorance is bliss. Let's put some lead in the drinking water. But those people are very rare. So in that case, they are now in this tricky situation. They need to argue that we are at the optimum. 100 IQ points, that's the best thing ever. And that's usually quite hard to argue. You can try to refine this argument, but I think it's a useful way of dislodging from the idea that the current state is the only thing that it could be. And this goes for in a lot of domains. So I mentioned the kind of cognition and the lifespan, but we might think about well-being. Right now, the human well-being scale might be something like -10 to 10. Okay, what if we could actually both nudge it up? Not just make sure we can avoid the agonism of -10, but move it so it's maybe in a range from 5 to 30, or even better, 30 to 100. So we could be feeling really good and not suffer. And at this point, of course, you have structural questions like, wait a minute, do we need some forms of pain to avoid damaging our bodies? Probably. But do we need to suffer from it? Could we construct motivation system that works on waves of bliss, like David Pearce likes to say? These are very good questions, and I think they're both philosophical questions, like is pain and suffering along the same scale? So if we just move everything up, nothing would change? Or is it that we're on different scales, so you can kind of remove suffering but still have well-being? And it might be that well-being is not even the important thing. We might want other things like meaning. Indeed, this might turn out to be quite multidimensional.
Yeah, I guess it's doubly difficult to defend the status quo, because if I'm trying to tell you that, I know, the 80-year lifespan average is optimal, I don't only need to explain why that happens to be optimal in the very big range of what's feasible, but I also need to explain why my kind of status quo defending forerunners were all wrong once the lifespan was shorter than it is now. But I'm right. So we're talking about transhumanism. I am keen to talk a bit about the history of this thing, because it's like surprisingly novel, and we get to kind of witness this thing like figure itself out. And you were there when it was much younger. So can you just say something about what it was like watching these kind of ideas grow up on, message boards and mailing lists in this kind of recent history of transhumanism?
Yeah, so transhumanism has antecedents going really far back. People have been wanting to live longer and feel better, of course, for a really long time. The Epic of Gilgamesh contains King Gilgamesh's search for the herb of immortality and so on. And certainly you find ideas like this showing up much earlier. You find them in the Enlightenment. You find an interesting blossoming in Britain in the 1920s and 30s with people like J.B.S. Haldane and J.D. Bernal and Stapledon kind of formulating many ideas that later are taken up. But when I started to come onto the scene in the 80s, I read books about cool American people thinking about cryonics, freezing people who were dead, or trying to settle space. And then in 1991, I went on the internet for the first time as a student. And I got relatively quickly onto this mailing list called the Extropian mailing list. So Extropy Institute was an organization founded by a bunch of early transhumanists. So they have met in the wider community of people interested in the future in the 80s. And this included the cryonics people and the life extension people and the pro-space people, the early nanotechnology pioneers, which were generally separate communities, but they started getting unified and linked up by this organization. which was also showing up at the time when more and more people could communicate using mailing lists. So we were sending emails to each other and having long conversations about can you rebuild Jupiter into a second star? What would it take? Can you do exploratory engineering about turning a Dyson sphere into computers? What about these newfangled ideas in biotechnology? Now, we like to think that that was a golden age where we're all kind of coming up with very clever ideas and we're all very polite, but we had these endless arguments about gun rights. And there is this interesting issue about, well, the political angle. I think Extrop Institute had very much of this kind of Californian libertarian view, which I find totally fine. I regard myself as a Swedish libertarian, which is kind of a weird mixture. But
what is the Swedish aspect?
Well, mostly that I am from Sweden. But then, of course, being this conflict-adverse Scandinavian, I'm not willing to go full objectivist on people and be rude to them. I don't really want to take any conclusion, draw it too far. And many libertarians take a great joy in doing that. And I think in general, as I matured politically, I'm still regarding myself a libertarian, but now I'm a Bayesian libertarian. I'm starting with this prior that, people should be free to do whatever they want, and governments are pretty dangerous things we should be very careful with. But if there's evidence that there is a market failure here, okay, let's try to fix it in the minimal way possible. Let's update in a sensible manner. Now, the interesting thing is, of course, that Extrop Institute, those early days of in the 90s, were also formative in the sense that the web was emerging. Wired magazine was talking about that the future is extropian. People were getting involved. So gradually we got the World Transhumanist Association, which contained a lot of people who've been organizing in Europe and were not quite as California libertarian and had very different perspectives. And that led to a formation of a wider transhumanist movement, mostly online. But in the 90s, one of the most common things you could hear is, I've been a transhumanist for a long time. I just didn't know that it was called that. But people had found the mailing list or found my website. I'd made a big website, which was mostly because I'm kind of the type of reviewer who loves to link a big catalog of stuff. So I made this big catalog of transhumanist web pages and papers, trying to link them together. So that made me a little bit of an integral part of the movement that way. Now, of course, this webpage is long since abandoned. I archived it. I think it's historically interesting. Sometimes I cringe a lot when I read some of the stuff on it, but it was important to bring people together. And of course, as the transhumanist movement became wider, you got a bigger political spectrum. A lot of the leftists didn't all like the libertarians. On the Swedish transhumanist mailings, we had a flame war, which made us somewhat libertarian people decide we're going to prove the left is wrong. We're going to start a commercial think tank with transhumanist goals and make money from this, and that's going to prove them wrong. If we had even given 5 minutes thinking, we would realize nobody on the political left would ever have thought that's good evidence for anything. But of course, we actually started the political think tank, and it actually worked quite well for a number of years and had slight impact in Swedish policy. So what happened was basically that many of the people who got their ideas in the 90s then didn't exactly grow up, but they started implementing and building organization, doing things. Which is why now you could say transhumanism might be the state religion of Silicon Valley. And it certainly has affected a lot of things, not always for the best. Sometimes we were woefully naive, and then when naive ideas get scaled up, they don't work or cause interesting trouble. Many of the ideas we had about digital currencies freeing up people to live in an anarcho-capitalist utopia, okay, Bitcoin didn't quite usher in that golden era. And when looking back, some of those arguments were really, really bad in the first place. Still, it's interesting to notice that the digital currencies and the various cool things you can do using blockchain, they seem to be really fruitful. Many of the concerns about artificial intelligence safety that started showing up because transhumanists were one of the few groups of people willing to take superintelligence very seriously, then led to very useful research on AI safety. Just because you might start out with an unusual angle doesn't mean that you end up with something useless. In fact, the transhumanist willingness to think that the future could be radically better also implies by symmetry that it could be radically worse, which means it's a fertile reason to try to work against existential risk and be willing to think unthinkable scenarios. So it's not a coincidence that I'm also doing X-risk research and that quite a lot of the old-timers in the X-risk community have links to the transhumanist community.
Feel free to dismiss this as an ignorant millennial question, but do you think there was like anything special about this communication being like through the internet, or really the internet being like the shaping place of this like transhumanist movement, either in allowing what kinds of people were able to access it, or the very like type of medium of communication you had when you were discussing these ideas?
The really dramatic transition was the availability of people across the world who could encounter each other. So from the current perspective, and now I'm getting to stroke my old white beard here, the 80s were a really weird era from the current perspective, because finding people meant going somewhere, or maybe even writing a letter. Kind of almost like you would have done in the 16th century with a quill. Okay, you had a typing machine. If you're really fancy, you might have a dedicated word processor. Actually communicating and finding people with similar views to you was very hard if you had unusual views. Maybe you were lucky and lived in a big city, so you could somehow find friends of friends with shared views. But it was hard to find the people who shared unusual positions. And then you got online, and mailing lists and Usenet. We should not forget Usenet, which is probably rather forgotten by now, but that was the kind of first essentially global bulletin board system, allowed people interested in a particular topic to exchange messages about that. And that created online communities that then later, of course, became websites, and then later as blogging was invented. Blogging is kind of shockingly late, actually. It came about in the late 90s. Today, of course, we would say blogging, isn't that something very ancient, some kind of pre-Twitter thing? But actually, the fact that you could make even a website that made it easy to make posts about your own things and make easy web pages and home pages, that's relatively recent on this decade timescale. But this meant that people could form communities even when they have very rare preferences. And that is the joy and beauty of the 90s. A lot of people say, oh, what happened in the 90s? And the answer is the web. The web essentially created the modern world where a lot of unusual communities formed. And then they are, of course, evolving. I think, for example, current transhumanism is a little bit suffering from the problem that it's having to compete with effective altruism, which I think is great in many ways. In fact, the fact that many transhumanists are probably not spending as much time on being transhumanists as being effective altruists. Bingo, that's great. We want to see evolution of communities. Now, what happened in the 90s was that these media, of course, allowed certain forms of communities to function much better than others. So as you invent new media, different forms of connection are possible. And also, of course, different forms of flame wars and disconnection and witch hunts. One shouldn't imagine that these technologies are neutral. There is this brilliant article by Scott Alexander, The Toxoplasma of Rage, where he points out, among other things, how the quoting system on Tumblr and to some extent on Twitter create this kind of wolf packs hunting down people who have the wrong views by posting that this guy, look how horrible this view is. And you show it to your friends who are probably going to have your views. And then we're all kind of saying, this is a bad guy. You create this focus effect, which is quite destructive, and you get the little local witch hunts. How you design a medium affects quite strongly what you can do with it. Blogs are good for making long rambling posts. Maybe they're a little bit less good for having the ongoing conversations. A mailing list might be good for that. But then you get flame wars. We were kind of struggling with that in the early 90s. Oh no, somebody mentioned gun rights again. Let's try to ban talk about guns from this mailing list. And then we have a flame war about whether banning talk about guns infringes on our rights, etc. And everybody's talking about that instead of transhumanism. So one should definitely not imagine that the 90s was a kind of golden age, but it was a formative age. As is, of course, any other period when you invent new media. I think we should recognize that we should be ready for a few new media every decade, and some of them are going to be just as disruptive and interesting as the current social media are.
I just find that point about media so interesting. And I think it's just like the example of podcasts themselves, right? This is a bit of a meta point, but it's so interesting that it seems to be one of the few medias at the moment where you don't get as much of those rage wars, or at least people are able to interpret nuances or like different points very differently, even if it's the same person making the same argument on a podcast than they do like on Twitter. There just seems to be something about that medium that gets people to respond to it differently.
Yeah, and I think there are some natural reasons for this, because we're having a nice conversation here. If we actually turn into a yelling match, we're probably not going to post this.
We've cut all of the yelling bits out.
Yeah.
This is a 6-hour conversation.
Yep. Yeah. If I'm sounding hoarse, that was because I was standing on my chair shouting at you. But the interesting thing is, it both creates context, and it's very hard to break up the context right now. If I write something on a blog post, somebody can quote my most outrageous sentence and tweet about it. Look, Anders believes this horrible thing. Without context, it's very easy to make me look like a racist or an idiot. And that can feed on itself. Because of this being relatively hard to do with sound and video, it's not happening. Also, the searchability is interesting. If I say a particular sentence right now, it's very hard to do a Google search for that I'm saying it in a podcast. In a few years, that's not going to be true. We're already getting good captioning systems. And of course, many of the best podcasts also have a lot of commentary and transcripts around. But the medium is the message, as Marshall McLuhan famously said. And different media allow you to do very different things. So being careful about what medium you use, and even thinking about, well, when I'm trying to set up this community, what media should we favor? Yeah. That is a very valuable thought, and if you do it right, then you win.
This is something I wanted to ask, which is when you find yourself in the early days of some new medium, so like early mailing lists, early blogs, early social media platforms, first of all, how steerable do you think these things are, or do they just work themselves out naturally? And how much hope is there just for kind of like really good mechanism design in terms of just making flame wars less likely and making it more likely that you have really productive conversations? Like, how sensitive do you think all this stuff is to just like early steering, and how good could things be?
I think there is both a chance of pushing things, but unfortunately there is going to be a lot of randomness in the early steering. We can never really avoid that. After all, the structure of the internet came about very much because of particular projects. The French Minitel system was a real contender, but because of the French insularity within their own language and legal structure, it never spread that far abroad. But it kept on going quite long after the web conquered the rest of the world. And I quite often bring up that in the early 70s, when people were coming up with the email protocols, if they had invited an economist, that economist could have told them, look, if it costs nothing to send email, basic economics predicts that people will send infinite email. You probably want to add a cost here. Now, nobody ever invited an economist to those meetings because they were not thinking that economics was even a relevant science here. But I think there is a real value here in trying to think ahead and getting people in from sociology and economics and other domains to try to see, okay, what do your domains say the obvious failure modes are? Yeah. Can we do something about that? Then people invent solutions. So on mailing lists, people quickly realize that, yeah, sometimes you need a moderator or even several moderators if there's a lot of traffic. On Usenet, people notice that every September you get a lot of new students at the universities. Okay, and they all ask the same stupid questions. Let's make this FAQ, frequently asked questions, and post them at regular intervals, and hopefully that's going to make them not getting too confused. Yeah. Turns out that was not enough, but it was a useful idea to gather things together. Now, you could imagine, for example, an email system where it cost you a tiny microtransaction to send things. That would have been an internet without spam. But it was hard to implement microtransactions in the 70s. It was hard to implement microtransactions in the 1990s, even in the early noughties. So one great theorist of comics and sequential art, as he likes to call it, is Scott McCloud. He made a very good comic Zot, with exclamation mark. And he also wrote this seminal book, Understanding Comics, where he was analyzing the comics as a medium and really doing a good theoretical job of explaining what's going on here. And then the sequel was essentially, okay, what's the future of comics? And he realized, the web. And we can do so many cool things. We have an infinite canvas here. We can do a lot of cool stuff. He was pointing at early web comics and even helping them. And then he got into this question, how do you actually make this work? Well, you need to pay for them. And he was also into microtransactions. And that's the big failed prediction in that book, because we didn't get them. And the real reason is, of course, microtransaction doesn't work well with credit card systems. Yes. Typically, the cost of a transaction below a certain level is a loss for everybody involved.
I'm obsessed with micropayments, so I'm glad you're talking about these. There's an interesting part of the history, though, where some protocol was suggested for making micropayments because it was just assumed that this would be just the de facto thing. And now still, to this day, it's just not especially easy. But it should be easy.
Yeah, it should be easy, but the problem was the people developing the technological infrastructure didn't know enough about the financial infrastructure. They didn't even quite recognize that this is way more complex than just getting the right protocol on the computer. You actually need banks to agree on things. You need to convince Visa to do certain things. And that requires probably lawyers and other scary people. And at this point, the insularity to some extent of the computer world really hamstrung them. Yeah. The funny thing is, of course, that now we're in this renaissance of micropayments. Why? Partially because people invented institutions like Patreon. Partially because you got fintech companies finding ways of bundling payments in various clever ways. Partially because of eventually the digital currencies taking off. It's worth noticing that we were kind of going on all cipher anarchists in the 90s and envisioning things. And the protocols were looking really good on paper. You could prove things, but nothing really worked. We didn't even get to use very much encrypted email. Why did Bitcoin take off? Well, it did something super innovative with the blockchain. That was a real insight. And it managed to acquire enough critical mass. And then, of course, things took off and created all sorts of other weirdness. But that's hard to predict.
Yeah, there's this hard to predict network effect or critical mass thing where you can show something's possible in theory, but then you often have to wait a long time, and then some version down the line takes off. I guess there's like an analogy to neural networks where the theory was there far earlier than they ended up working. And they only ended up working, I guess, just because of scale rather than any huge breakthroughs. And then similarly, Bitcoin it's not like enormously elegant, and it's not as if it has entirely new ideas there, but I guess it just had like the right timing and the right amount of buy-in.
Yeah, I think people quite often imagine that innovations are kind of something just springing up complete and whole. But most innovation consists of taking 90% things that existed before, putting them together in the right way, and maybe adding, if you're really innovative, 10% of something new. And you quite often need that past innovations because that makes it compatible with existing things. So Bitcoin, for example, is dependent on various encryption infrastructure that was already well established because of the web. And that infrastructure that enabled the web was actually subject to enormous battles in the 90s. We had the crypto wars. There was serious attempts by the US government to restrict the use of encryption by civil society and make sure that private key encryption wasn't spread abroad. It was regarded as military munitions, and the fact that Bruce Schneier's book Applied Cryptography contained a CD with a source code meant that it couldn't be exported abroad with that CD because that was munitions. Now, of course, somebody just copied down the code from the pages abroad and put it up on the web and kind of demonstrated that this doesn't work like that. But this was a serious battle. It's worth noticing that public key cryptography was kind of invented in secret by intelligence agencies and then leaked out, or rather were independently reinvented in the 80s and early 90s. So you have this long backstory leading up to the point where suddenly Bitcoin can work. So in the 90s, we were thinking that digital currencies, we have the protocols, this should just be a matter of implementing them. But there was not a critical mass online. You couldn't actually make use of many things seamlessly, which was possible much later. And getting back to the topic, when you think about creating communities and organizations, they also, of course, draw on previous ones. So Extropy Institute didn't just show up randomly in Los Angeles. It was the result of people interested in futurism, unified by ideas shared through science fiction, through various science conferences, through Omni magazine, which was a science fiction magazine, but also contained quite a lot of art and popular science. And when you start tracing things back, you find the branches coming in from the 60s and 70s, where Timothy Leary, who's today mostly known as the great guru of LSD, but he was also very much into space migration, intelligence increase, and life extension. Of course, he believed LSD and psychedelics would be an integral part in this, but he also believed that, well, once enough of people take psychedelics, they're going to open their minds and we're going to accelerate our progress. The science fiction world contains a canon of ideas, and when you look at where they come from, you find a lot of popularizers of science. And when you come back to those people around Bernal and Stapledon and Haldane, so Haldane, in his classic essay Daedalus, which was based on a lecture held in Cambridge in 1925 or something like that, he was talking about, well, right now physics seems to be riding high. Those quantum guys and that Einstein guy seem to be doing important things. And this century is probably going to get dominated by physics. The next century is going to be the century of biotechnology. And he's essentially outlining many of the modern concerns with biotechnology. What about GMO spreading? What about us modifying ourselves and our environment? What does this lead to? How do people react to the possibility of changing the species? He was ahead of time, but also based very much on thinking at the time. He wrote another essay, The Last Judgment, which is one of the first really good existential risk essays. He's talking about the end of the world and points out that natural disasters are unlikely to be the end of humanity. Humanity is probably the most likely cause of the end of humanity. And then he outlines a little bit of a science fiction scenario where using tidal energy, because he was very concerned about the energy crisis, because we're going to run out of fossil fuels. Well, if you get all your energy from tidal energy, you're going to make the moon slowly spiral inwards. And if you do this too much, eventually it's going to collide with Earth. So he's sketching this somewhat fanciful future scenario, which ends with the survivors of humanity settling Venus and becoming a hive intelligence. We're talking 1920s here. And J.D. Bernal, meanwhile, writes The World, the Flesh, the Devil, another really classic book, where he's discussing ways we might modify ourselves. It's very much transhumanism. He's also thinking about how we can replace our organs with artificial organs and becoming cyborgs, which of course makes it much easier to live in space and build space habitats and eventually maybe upload ourselves into pure energy or something like that. A lot of these things became part of the science fiction canon, and even though the ideas might have gone out of fashion in some periods of time, they were kind of kept inside the science fiction canon and influencing other people. So it's very fun to trace where ideas come from, how people use and reuse them.
Well, it's so interesting because there's an analogy here, right? So previously we were talking about when technologies take off, and you were saying that very often the ideas are in place and they end up hibernating for a few decades. And then maybe one extra idea comes along or a critical mass of users comes along and suddenly you get an inflection point where this thing totally takes off. And often it's really hard to predict when that moment comes. But, you know, as it is for technology, so it is, I guess, sometimes for kind of intellectual and cultural movements where you have these really early forerunners who are talking about this stuff that is kind of still weird and sci-fi now. And then the ideas just kind of sit and collect dust for decades. And then something changes where the ideas suddenly kind of spread. And it's also hard to predict. Often you get this in kind of political revolutions as well, right? Where it turns out that lots of people were falsifying preferences, like legalizing gay marriage happened not at all or not very much for a very long time. And then all at once, I'm wondering if something could be applied there to transhumanism itself, because it's still kind of neat.
I think this is very true for practically all big transitions in history. you need to build up an infrastructure of ideas. They actually need to be good enough ideas that they hold together in a self-consistent way. An awful lot of ideas are not consistent at all. They're just random musings of people and will never go anywhere. There are also some ideas that are just so well hidden that you will not find them easily. So you might discover them way after they would normally have taken off, but they're so rare. So you might have something almost like when you have super cooled water. You're way beyond the transition point, and then something happens very suddenly. But quite often you have this gradual build-up. And this is, of course, a classic in the question about how you create social change. One of my favorite essays is Friedrich von Hayek's The Intellectuals and Socialism. He's writing this in 1945. He's basically one of a few classical liberals around. Everybody else at the faculty think that, planned economics and socialism seems to be the future. They seem to be doing really well. Although, of course, the fascists seem to have a good running for a while. But maybe the future is socialists. And Hayek totally disagrees, and then he wonders, how come everybody around me is feeling socialist? And he's arguing that this has a lot to do with whether you copy ideas from other fellow intellectuals, and intellectuals spread it to society. So he's making this observation: if I want to make my ideas affect society, I need to first make them spread among the intellectuals. A few years later, at the Mount Pelerin in Switzerland, the Mount Pelerin Society has a meeting, and the Hayek and Mises and the others are kind of discussing this and thinking, this is a good idea, we should try to do that. So let's educate academics and successors, build think tanks, and gradually we keep on doing it. And then you get Reagan and Thatcher and the neoliberal revolution. But it literally takes 1 or 2 generations. And more recently, just a few days ago, actually, there is a conservative scholar, John Greer, I think his name is, who did a very equally good article, indeed citing Hayek and others, pointing out that why did we conservatives lose the culture war? We were doing so well in putting judges in place. And the real reason is, of course, the liberals, they were the liberals in the American sense here. They were kind of getting the kids to become socialists and really leftist. So the fact that our institutions are conservative doesn't help, because in a while they're going to get replaced by socialist judges, and then we're kind of screwed over. Now, his point was, of course, you need to do this intergenerational work. You actually need to affect the ideas of unborn people. And this is, of course, what all movements do, more or less effectively. The problem is, of course, everybody's trying to do it. And many of the most powerful ideas are not the ideas that people are struggling over. It's not the left-right ideas, but some completely different perspective. If you think about environmentalism, for example, concern about the environment was kind of growing. Evidence that things were going badly for the environment were slowly growing. And then you get crystallization points like Rachel Carson's Silent Spring that points out both poetically and factually that, we're having a serious problem here. And at that point, you can start crystallizing around it and build a movement. Now, the funny thing is, of course, when you look at green parties around Europe, it's very rare that they end up being the one sitting in power and having the prime minister. But that doesn't matter, because all the other parties need to have an environmental agenda in order to avoid losing voters to the Green Party. So now all the parties are actually Green parties. The same thing for gay rights, or for that matter, anti-racism, abolitionism, and so on. You want to build up a nice set of ideas. You want to give evidence that this is the moral thing to do. This is emotionally nice thing to do. It's actually practical. We can actually free the slaves without losing our way of living. We can actually give women the right to vote. It's not going to crash society. And we have a lot of moral reasons for that. And gradually, you reach that critical point. It might be that we're getting this faster and faster. If you look at the time it took for female suffrage between the first state in the United States approving it and the Supreme Court kind of just making the law of land, and then comparing that to things like allowing alcohol or abortion or in gay marriage, it seems to speed up. Whether this is a good thing or not is an interesting issue, because it might also be that you jump the gun so quickly that it's not fully accepted in all parts of society. So you also lock in a lot of tensions. It's a little bit like glass. If you cool it down too quickly, you actually do get a lot of internal tensions that might make it crack more easily. And it might be that societies can only adapt so far. So you want to make sure that your transition is not quite too fast, because then you might get pockets of resistance that you can never get rid of. You might actually want it to happen at a somewhat sensible speed, whatever that is.
Well, one thing I kind of want to add into the mix is admittedly a bit of a half-baked thought, but when we're talking about these kind of takeoffs or like these sudden like changes either in technologies or these kind of like intellectual movements, is as well like kind of the roles of earlier bubbles or fads. You often see, right, that people think something is going to really take off and then it doesn't, or at least you see like lots of failures. You had that, for example, in like the early 2000s with the dot-com crash. You had that arguably with Bitcoin as well. But you can also get that in some like kind of intellectual movements. And I think that's like a really interesting thing to maybe pick up on as well, that these bubbles are often necessary for these later takeoffs, that they get infrastructure in place or they help disseminate ideas or at least build up a collection of knowledge that might not be useful or profitable now, but it allows people later on to draw on from this. And even if, we have failures now that might not be super clear, they can still be really useful later on.
Yeah. My own original field of neural networks is, of course, a beautiful example. Artificial intelligence and neural network have been going through these bubbles a number of times. So on one hand, you had this enormous optimism in the early 50s with the Dartmouth conference, essentially saying, if we spend a summer thinking about this, we might make some real progress. And we did, but it wasn't exactly solving AI. And the early ideas that, within a decade or two, we could have human-level intelligence definitely didn't come to pass. And after a while, these big promises didn't hold up and funding dried out and you got an AI winter. And this has been repeating. Now, in some sense, that might have been good because the field matured step by step. It was also a bad thing because many people left things and many things were forgotten because people didn't even want to mention artificial intelligence or neural networks after a particular embarrassing bubble. I vividly remember in the 90s talking to my advisor about those deep neural networks. That Schmidhuber guy had been doing some very cool stuff in the 80s. Maybe we should try it out again. And my wise advisor told me, no, it didn't work out. It didn't get anywhere. And he was totally right in 1997 because we didn't have enough data to train the networks or enough computing power to train them long enough to actually get the cool results that erupted on the scene in kind of 2012. At that point, things were mature enough to really be different. And even the fact that things were really different when you scaled things up was a non-trivial finding. Nobody really expected that inside the field. There had been a few cases where papers claimed that if I scale this up enough, things change. And that's cool, but we didn't see that as an overall pattern. That was for that particular model. So the problem here might be, of course, that you also have that people inside the field don't know when you get a bubble. So the classic model for these bubbles is the Gartner hype curve, at least when you come to technology. So you start out with a few people talking about that this is really cool, and then it spreads, and then you get this exponential growth where both the early researchers are telling journalists about it, and they are telling others, and investors are getting interested, and it's in everybody's interest to hype things. So you will quickly get over the rails because people will immediately say, this is going to change everything real soon now. And then after a while, real soon now has passed and it's still not ready for prime time. Just look at the self-driving cars. In 2006, people started to hype them. In 2005, most people didn't believe it would happen at all. People were pointing at experiments saying, look, this is not going anywhere. And then the DARPA Grand Challenge demonstrated that, they can almost do something, but it's kind of laughably ineffective. But, next year it was way better. And then the hype train started. Now, of course, we realize autonomous cars in actual traffic is a very tough problem. And we need to deal with some really deep questions about how many people can be allowed to be run over by autonomous cars, even if they're a good idea. But this is forcing a maturation on the domain. What typically happens according to the hype curve is that you get this trove of disillusionment, that people say, no, we tried it and it didn't work out. And then people are still developing technology and eventually get up on a reasonable plateau where it's actually doing something useful. Of course, some technologies completely falter because It's just too hard to maintain an infrastructure or a core group of people developing them. Sometimes it might be that you rediscover them much later, but sometimes it just gets subsumed by completely different technologies. Now, the hype curve, I think, is one model. It's not always true, but it's a useful thing to recognize both for social movements and for many other things. And of course, social movements have the other problem that they need to compete against each other. They need to compete for interest. There is fashion. Many people want to have an identity. But identity might be much more important than what the movement is about. So you end up with movements that might actually not be acting for their own good. The environmentalist movement was about kind of saving the environment. But then it also got linked to various other ideological views. So the original environmentalists were quite often very, very conservative. Indeed, you get very dark and scary forms of conservatism linked to early environmentalism, for example, in Nazi Germany, which actually for its time had some of the most extensive environmental protections of the era. And then you get instead the small is beautiful and the kind of the 60s and 70s hippie view of how the future should be in a lot of environmentalist movement, which means that you have a big tension now on actually the solution to carbon dioxide emissions might be more nuclear.
Yeah. We did an episode on this.
Yeah. And it's very fun to see some people who normally say, yeah, I think climate change is the top thing. And then I ask them, so you're in favor of nuclear? And you just see them stop in the tracks because they can't bring themselves to think that thought, which should be a thinkable thing. They might react it for other reasons, but they're just taking up this mix of ideological things. And that's, of course, a problem for many movements. Transhumanism is included here. Transhumanism doesn't have a core value theory. And I think that is a real problem. It's also a practical thing for transhumanists because that means you can link it to any value theory. But it means that you have Christian transhumanists and fascist transhumanists and virtue ethics transhumanists and the utilitarian transhumanists and cosmist transhumanists. And deep down, they don't at all agree on why we should be doing this.
Do you have any views like on how this might relate to effective altruism, either in terms of like hypes or like kind of winters and summers of ideas, or as you mentioned, kind of these core values?
So I think effective altruism, in some sense, has a core value theory, at least from the start. It starts out in a very utilitarian, consequentialist corner of a map. Now, can you be a conservative effective altruist? Totally. You can construct that view. Can you be a socialist effective altruist? Yep, no problem. Can you be a virtue ethics effective altruist? Why not? I think you can construct that. You can link it up and construct these other views. But when you start out in a particular tribal or ideological corner, it might be hard to escape that. I think that is what we're seeing with the environmentalist movement. They're kind of stuck right now because we have become partially part of the left, which means that conservative environmentalism has nowhere to go. It needs to be either dropping conservative or dropping environmentalism. And I think there is a real risk, of course, that one lets this minor headache stop oneself. Effective altruism has some relatively abstract core goals, and you want to infect them in a lot of other groups. The success of the Green parties in Europe have been very much about making every party, regardless of what their ideology is, actually trying to do something good for the environment. And similarly, you could imagine if you had the same situation for effective altruism, you want all of them, regardless of what their ideology is, to try to be effective altruists. Then why they're being effective might be totally different from the conservatives and the leftists. So I think also there is this interesting thing that I think the hype curve peak for effective altruism has passed. In some sense, the honeymoon where the things were flocking in, it was very easy to get people, have stopped. And there is a lot of critics, which is brilliant. One of the greatest moments for transhumanism happened in the early noughties when Francis Fukuyama wrote Our Post-Human Future, which is, in my opinion, one of the best books in favor of transhumanism ever. He's, of course, arguing that transhumanism is the worst idea we have. We need to fight against this very dangerous idea that is threatening to undermine everything we hold dear. And he's throwing all the arguments he can at transhumanism. They're not all compatible. In fact, he's trying all arguments at the same time because he wants to kind of try to convince the reader, which actually makes it rather intellectually unconvincing in many ways. But also when somebody of his stature, who is also tied a little bit to George W. Bush administration, states that something is bad, then you get a lot of people just rising up to defend it, and you get a lot of interesting conversation. In the end, I think that was the chance for transhumanists to also mature quite a bit. Yeah, we need to respond to this long list of arguments. Many of them are crappy, but we still need to do a proper response. We can't just hide in our mother's basement all the time. So that was very, very useful. And I think effective altruism it might still be waiting for its Francis Fukuyama, but I think it's actually useful to be engaged in a lot of debates against people who disagree for various reasons. Mm-hmm. That also creates both weird random allies. Not always the allies you want. Sometimes you might find getting absolutely horrible allies that you really want to distance yourself from. Transhumanists have always been quite embarrassed when New Agers and ufologists declare themselves transhumanists. And we also have this interesting opportunity of saying what ideas are solid enough to work even when many people don't agree with them. Mm. Because in the end, of course, if you are a true consequentialist and want to actually see improvement in the world, you want to reach that plateau where effective altruism actually works. Not just this a great idea somebody has or a very cool organization, but actually it's just part of everything.
Mm. I'm conscious of time and that you might want to eat lunch soon. Maybe start thinking about wrapping up.
Sure.
Yeah, well, time itself is a kind of an interesting question. What time perspective should one take on things? So one of my experiences being involved in transhumanism is in the 90s we were so optimistic and we were hoping for by the 2000 at the very least we're going to have good anti-aging medicine and the nano machines should be coming, and then we get the singularity by 2020 or 2030 at the most. Mm. And then it turned out that was not quite true. So Ray Kurzweil might be saying 2045 and he still seemed to be holding on to that. But the general realization is, of course, we tend to overestimate how rapidly things can go. In the early part of an exponential curve, it's very, very slow. Mm. And you can kind of see where it could be going, but that doesn't mean it's actually going to grow as fast as you want to. And indeed, quite often there are random factors slowing things down. In the long run, even a fairly low growth rate totally takes over and changes things. So the web is still transforming the world in a lot of ways. These days, most documents are published primarily somewhere on the web. Maybe on a private web, maybe on a Google Docs, but they're not primarily on paper or in a computer, at least if they're shared between two people. That is really transforming our idea about documents and communication. We're still discovering what social media can do and what they cannot do. Many of these things are cumulative. We're still kind of reeling from the Industrial Revolution, and in some sense, we're still adjusting to what we messed up with the Agricultural Revolution. So the timing issue is that we quite often believe that our latest, coolest idea is going to be a revolution that is going to transform the world real soon now. Yeah. And that's a mistake. If you can really time when you make your startup or build your organization to fit with the ideological climate and the new technologies, then you can take off. But that requires a lot of knowledge and honestly a lot of luck. So generally it needs to take time, and we should be planning for the long-term future. I think that's one of the most important issues. We are not going to win maybe this generation, but the next one. Mm-hmm. We might say, okay, we're going to make a sustainable civilization and we better hurry up to make it as good as possible. But if it takes 50 years and doesn't do too much damage, that's still a win. Maybe we can't move a galaxy this millennium or this galactic year. Yeah, but the next one.
Talking about things that don't turn out quite true, I feel like this is a good segue for our final question, which we ask all our guests. And that is, what is a significant thing that you've recently changed your mind about and why?
So one thing that I'm really surprised that actually worked was the travel restrictions that happened in the wake of COVID. Now, to be honest, I think the travel restrictions have not been used that effectively. COVID had been spreading widely anyway. But back in the early 2020, I was having some rather intense arguments with friends online and on Twitter about should you shut down airline traffic. And I was of the opinion, look, we tried doing that for Ebola in Africa, and that was an economic crisis which was really bad for a lot of vulnerable countries. if we do this globally, that's going to be a total disaster. We must not do that. Now, it turns out that shutting down a lot of airline travel actually didn't cause it like that. The difference was partially that many of the very vulnerable countries in Africa, they were very dependent on people traveling across borders. But actually developed economies have way more resiliency. So if at least the developed world had cut down airline travel quickly enough, and I don't think we would have been able to do it for COVID actually. But if we had, then we would probably be able to contain that. So I think we should be more ready to actually do that kind of things. The problem is, of course, we need to have reliable signals that a new virus has shown up. We need to be cutting links in the global network carefully. And there is going to be noise in those signals. So if we shut down the airlines all the time when we see a new virus, we're always going to be shutting them down. And that's probably not going to be good. But I'm kind of surprised how well the world can still work, even though we're electronically connected rather than physically connected.
It's an interesting Swedish libertarian argument.
Yeah. And I love travel. I self-identified very much as a cosmopolite traveler, having opinions about the best coffee places in San Francisco and Amsterdam. And actually being stranded in one place for months at a time, I would have imagined that would drive me crazy. But of course, no, I'm not crazier than usual. Actually, there are other ways of handling it. Still, there are many people who've been suffering through COVID, especially the extroverts, and they're also very loud about that, very unhappy about it. The funny thing is, on the other hand, if you look at studies of happiness, you find that actually it's been recovering quite well.
Subjective well-being in the US, I saw yesterday, is about as high as it's been in decades, like right now.
Yeah, and part of that might be that now we're having more hope that this is actually ending. And this is something we know from the Blitz. A lot of Londoners subjected to missile attacks were still finding life worth living and actually feeling it very meaningful to resist that. And in many places subject to bombings, people were keeping up hope quite well. Is when you lose hope, that's when society crashes. Mm-hmm. When you get even a smidgen of hope, that can actually make us pull through and adapt. And that's another one of the wonders of the human condition that we should cherish and kind of try to amplify.
That's a nice note to end on. One last question we ask everyone is, what 3 books or articles, films, podcasts, whatever, would you recommend for anyone interested in finding out about the 15,000 things we just talked about?
So the Fermi Paradox, I think the classic book about it might be Sagan and Shklovsky's book from the 60s about kind of searching for extraterrestrial intelligence. By now it's really obsolete, but it's so interesting to see how people were thinking about it back then. There is also this very good modern book by Vacco about the Drake equation. Basically 2 chapters for every term, talking about what people believed in back in before the 1960s and afterwards, how we've been updating. And then we have transhumanism. I think one book that has influenced me enormously is Olaf Stapledon's novels Last and First Men and Star Maker. So Last and First Men is his fictional depiction of the future of the human species and successor species going literally billions of years in the future. And it's a vast scope. It's kind of a classic thing that has influenced science fiction tremendously. And then Star Maker broadens the scope to all intelligence, not just in the universe, but actually in all other universes too. And all the plot, I think 15 billion years of a plot in Last and First Men occurs on one page inside the Star Maker. That scope is unmatched. It's unrivaled. It's very dry by modern standards. It's kind of a very different form of science fiction novel because there is no really a protagonist except intelligence itself. But I think as a formative story, it's amazingly good. When it comes to forming my views on transhumanism, I read Ed Regis' The Great Mambo Chicken and the Transhuman Condition, which is kind of a reportage about the community that would become the transhumanist movement in the late 1980s. It's kind of interesting as a picture of a moment just before it started forming. And then I was also very influenced by Hans Moravec's Mind Children, which also came out at the same time. An early book taking superintelligence very seriously and kind of pointing out how weird the universe could really, really be.
Anders Sandberg. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
That was Anders Sandberg on the Fermi Paradox, Transhumanism, and many, many other things. As always, if you'd like to learn more, you can read the write-up at hearthisidea.com/episodes/Anders. That's ANDERS. And there you'll find links to all the books and articles that were mentioned, along with further reading. As always, it would be great if you could leave an honest review on Apple Podcasts or wherever you're listening to this. If you have constructive feedback, there's a link on the website to an anonymous feedback form. There's also a star rating form on the top and bottom of the write-up, and you can send suggestions, questions, and whatever else to feedback@hearthisidea.com. We'd love to hear from you. Finally, if you'd like to support the show more directly and help us to continue to pay for hosting, you can also leave a tip by following the link at the show notes. Thanks very much for listening.